Okay, so I filmed this video a few times because sometimes I find it difficult to keep talking. Sometimes my mind just stops and I find it difficult to get back to the line of thought that I was on. But so yeah, I was going to talk about so I've been discussing things with people online. I've been talking online with people, and there's a kind of whole community of people who are talking about the path and awakening and whatnot. I think I mentioned this in the last video as well. Yeah, I think I've been looking at a lot of the maps. There's a lot of maps out there, and there's a lot of kind of like theoretical stuff about the stages of awakening, and I kind of got sucked into that a wee bit because it seemed that the experiences that I'd had so far lined up quite well with what is described in some of these maps. But I've made the decision to kind of avoid them a little bit, or make the effort to avoid them, because I feel that I've got a very kind of analytical mind that likes to think about stuff and very active, and I found that these kind of maps were triggering that mental process to the point that it was distracting from my overall practice. But as far as I can see, that the subsequent levels of awakening that come after the initial one seem to just be deepening levels of the same insight. So I don't think it has to be too complicated. I've also been struggling to describe this. There have been people, like quite a few people I've been talking to online, and I find the conversations very helpful actually, because it's kind of solidifying my understanding of this to actually be talking about it to other people, and then getting other people's experience and then sharing my experience and so on. But I do find it difficult to put into words this, and I think that's because what I'm essentially describing is somewhat of a paradox. Like this whole thing is very paradoxical. I think I've said this before. A lot of this can't be understood by the thinking mind. It has to be, how many times have I said this? Probably a few. It has to be seen, has to be experienced. It's not the same as psychologically understanding something on the intellectual level and then applying that knowledge to then make a change in your life. It's more like a fundamental shift in your perspective that transcends all of the knowledge about it entirely. Very difficult to describe. The descriptions are all pointers. That's why you have to see it for yourself. I mean, the psychological understanding can help you, but I don't think you really need it. It comes as a response to the insight. The mind starts trying to process and talk about it, and I find it difficult to describe what it's like. So the best way I can maybe describe it is that before, you're in your head and you're going about as you in your head, relating to the world as this person, your thoughts, this body. So you're in your mind, you're your thoughts, you're this person, this body, and you're fully identified with your story in this world. The best way I can describe it is that your sense of identity, in a sense, I don't know if that's the best way to describe it, your sense of being moves from being here in the person, in the head, in the body. It expands out the way. It expands out. The access point to that. So that's where the freedom is here. is in that expansive perceptual shift out of the person. You're stepping out of the person in a sense. The access point to that, and where the freedom is in that, is in this exact present point of reality right now. And the further into that presence that you go, even transcending the idea of presence, transcending the idea of future and past and now, just this, you start to see how the nature of reality is transient and ever-changing and impermanent, and that's the true nature of reality. Narrative is of the mind. This whole time-space story is very much held together by the mind. The mind is the glue that holds all this together. When you pass through the mind right into the present moment, right now, as it is here, then reality as you perceive it before starts to come apart. Your boundaries start to dissolve, and you start to shift out into something else. In this, it's so difficult to describe it. It's internal, but it's not internal as well, because internal, your perception, and the external is the same thing. The access point is this present moment, away from the thoughts, through the thoughts, right here. It's right here. It's always right here, and this present moment is the precious thing, and it's like, it's the only thing that exists. But paradoxically, when you go into that, you realise that it doesn't exist either. And that's the whole non-dual paradox. What I talked about, the peripheral framing that is there, as I describe it, so I'm very much perceiving like an identity shift. I'm shifting my identity outwards and inwards at the same time, in an expansive sense. And I know now that, and I can see now, and I'm operating from the point of view that this is all the one thing, this is all a singularity. These multiple forms, transient, changing multiple forms, are temporary manifestations of the one consciousness, the one thing. Everything is the one thing, and it's kind of that sense of unity. I don't know if that's the best way to describe it, that brings about that neutrality, that brings about the freedom and the peace and the perspective. Because from the point of view of the ups and downs of the person, of the identification with the ego, that is just peaceful and free, because you're moving out of it. I don't know if that makes sense. And I was describing the kind of the dark night of the soul thing. So like, a big part of the peace and freedom you get from it is when you move into this moment and you, like I said, expand that out. Your perception shifts. You step out of the person, but when you're here now, you can actually observe reality. You can appreciate reality for what it is, and you get this. You're just kind of like, this is just this. What the fuck? It's amazing. It's absolutely incredible. But then that's also followed by, it was for me, the other what the fuck of, oh shit, what the fuck, in like a panic sense, because you lose your grounding, because you've been identified with this person for such a long time, your whole life, and you've built this identity up, and then when you drop that, you lose your bearings in a sense, and it's like a loss of control, and then the negative mind kicks in, and you get these thoughts of impermanence is terrifying, and the concept of non-duality is the mind is unable to process that, because the thinking mind and the person operate in this reality, this time-space, linear time reality of multiple forms and duality. It can't exist or function or comprehend that out with this reality. So it's terrifying. It really is terrifying. But the way I got through that, so it came for me like panic attacks and a kind of sadness and a kind of mourning sadness and a panic attacks and all these thoughts of, you know, what if I don't exist? What if all the people I love and care about don't exist? But how I got through that was just deeper insight and knowing that we didn't exist in the first place. That you don't exist. There is no person in the first place. And then let go of that. But the funny thing is, though, and the weird thing is, though, is when you let go of that, it's all still here. It's not as if it disappears. It's all still here. So you're not really letting go of anything. Like, what you're letting go of was your concept of reality, and your thoughts and ideas about it. Nothing is permanent. Obviously, this is a temporary. This is going to end. This form is going to come to an end. Obviously, we know that, but we try and convince ourselves that it persists. And I don't know. You know, I thought I was kind of agnostic, but then all these kind of secular kind of beliefs started coming to the surface of, you know, and I can see how this might be controversial, but this is just my experience. I can see how they're perpetuated for the need for the person to persist beyond death and so on, in a similar narrative to what we're experiencing now, but that's a fiction. You weren't even alive in the first place, but the funny thing is that you're also alive at the same time. So it's impossible to understand, but that's why I say that it's very difficult to explain this. Existence can't be without non-existence. It's a duality and they're interdependent. And when you're in one pole of each or whatever, that point of view can't exist without the other. It's about transcending that whole thing. And what I mean about reincarnation before is you're kind of, I have a different view of reincarnation now as well, and again that's hard to describe, as in, you know, time doesn't exist, but it does exist on some level, as an illusory kind of experiential construct, but you're reincarnating yourself into that all the time. Like every time you're reincarnating the person when you pick up the narrative and you identify with it, and essentially when you drop that, you're experiencing some form of death, although the physical body still persists. So, you know, very hard to describe this, but like I said, it's because it's paradoxical. But it's that sense of, I would say, the neutrality and the peace and the freedom of this shift in perspective compared to the life of the person is what people describe as bliss, but it's not a positive emotion. It's very neutral. Sorry, I've got a cold. Comparatively, neutrality is positive compared to the the person, because this is a lot of times somewhat of a rough experience, this identification. But it doesn't mean that you can't enjoy those experiences. In fact, you have an enhanced appreciation of everything, all the good and all the bad, simultaneously. because you're coming from a different place. You're identified with something different, something other than, something that transcends the person and the mind and the ego. And what I've also found is that after this shift, so obviously something's happened that's notable, and I'm just describing my experience, but there is a shift that happens when you practice this properly, and it's a shift that transcends the conceptual mind. That's I would have my doubts about listening to spiritual teachers and whatnot, and thinking, is this just a kind of a branch of psychology or whatever? And then the thinking will start. But yes, it is legitimate. The insight is legitimate, and it does seem to. It's like you're bypassing a lot of the. You work in yourself and you work in the person, but it's very difficult to do effectively unless you bypass the whole thing by shifting your perspective. But what I think I'm experiencing with this as well is that my meditative abilities have increased a million times. So when I was younger, I was very interested in Buddhism and enlightenment and awakening. So I'd read a lot about this kind of stuff, and I'd practice. But I found it very difficult to effortlessly drop the thinking mind or be empty. And it's kind of come full circle after a lot of life experience and conditioning and so on. And now, before the shift I was getting better at, and after the shift now is easy. There's no effort involved. I can drop the thinking mind, no bother, and I can maintain that state for extended periods of time, and varying degrees of depth. So that's a big thing, and I guess that's what they mean with the stream entry, is that you pass that point and it becomes easier, because you've maybe, that insight is what you needed to be able to once you've moved into that space, you know what that's like, and you can do it again, and you can just sit there. And that's what I mean when I say relax into it and sitting into it. It's effortless, and the thoughts, there's no effort to it. The thoughts will come and go. They might be peripheral, kind of like shapes and colours and ideas in the background, but they're just there, and they come and they go. And any reaction that you have, like I said, this is another difficult point to understand, is that the person still operates, the ego's still there, it still operates autonomously as its own thing. It does what it wants. It's just practiced conditionings. It's automatic. But now, because you're not pushing your attention onto that and getting attached to it, it reacts, and it just disappears into the void of nothing. And then the same thing happens again. It disappears into the void of nothing. And every time that happens, it loses a bit of its power. But the ego is exactly the same. It reacts to the same things because of the momentum has been there for a while. It's not perpetuated by thought though, so you start to see that these thought forms and emotional thought forms want to perpetuate themselves, and your mind it's like it takes energy from your mind and it revives itself, and it is looking for opportunities to do that all the time. And when you can see that whole process, then I knew this psychologically or conceptually. I knew this from reading about psychology and so on, but I didn't see it. I never saw it. I could see it in retrospect, but I could never see it play out in real time. So I think that's about 20 minutes, so I'll leave it there. That's all for now.